I never wanted to take that trip. From the moment Luke suggested it, something about the idea felt wrong. Not in a dramatic, life or death kind of way, but in a quiet, gut-deep unease I couldn't shake. A voice in the back of my mind kept whispering, "Don't go. Just don't go." But Luke, as stubborn as ever, brushed off my concerns like they were nothing. It was mid-December, and winter had already swallowed half the state. Thick layers of snow and ice covered everything, turning the roads into a treacherous mess. Even the most cautious drivers were ending up in ditches. It wasn't safe, I knew it, but Luke insisted. "We'll be fine," he kept saying. "Darren's expecting us. We can't just ghost him." Darren wasn't even my friend. He was Luke's old college buddy, someone I'd met maybe twice at awkward reunions. From what I gathered, they used to be close, best friends even, but over time their connection had faded. Conversations turned into sporadic texts, then nothing at all. Still, Luke always spoke about him with a kind of admiration. "Darren's one of the smartest guys I know," he'd say. "A little eccentric, sure, but solid." I should have asked what he meant by eccentric. The second we hit the road, I knew we'd made a mistake. Snow fell in thick, heavy sheets, swallowing the road ahead. The headlights barely cut through the storm, and the wind howled like something alive, rattling the car as we crawled forward. The GPS was useless, signal lost miles ago. The map froze on the screen, and there were no street signs, no landmarks. Just an endless stretch of snow-covered road winding deeper into nowhere. We hadn't passed another car in hours. Luke gripped the wheel tightly, squinting into the whiteout. "Almost there," he muttered, but his knuckles were white. I stared out the window, watching the landscape blur into a void of white nothingness. There was no civilization out here, no houses, no gas stations. Just endless trees, dark and skeletal against the snow. A sinking feeling settled in my stomach. By the time we reached Darren's place, I was on edge. The cabin wasn't what I'd pictured. I'd imagined something warm and rustic, a cozy log cabin nestled between pine trees, maybe with smoke curling from the chimney. But this wasn't cozy. It was a small, sagging structure, half buried in snow. The wood was warped and blackened with age, and the windows were dark. No lights, no movement. It looked abandoned, like it had been sitting out here for years, untouched and forgotten. I hesitated. "Are you sure this is the right place?" Before Luke could answer, the front door swung open. Darren stood in the doorway, grinning, and instantly, I knew something was wrong. He looked different, thinner, paler. His skin stretched too tight over sharp cheekbones, his eyes slightly sunken. But what unsettled me most wasn't how he looked. It was his eyes. They flicked past us, scanning the darkness behind us before finally settling back on me. Like he was checking for something. Like he expected something else to be standing there. "You made it," he said, stepping back to let us in. His voice was cheerful, but his grin was too wide. The moment we stepped inside, I heard the lock slide into place. Not just locked, bolted. The inside was worse than the outside. Messy papers were scattered across the floor, some covered in frantic, scrawled handwriting. Dishes were piled high in the sink, untouched for days. A single clock on the wall ticked too loudly, filling the silence. And the smell, it wasn't strong, just faintly off. Metallic like old blood. Darren moved around the room with a kind of nervous energy, rubbing his hands together for warmth. "Man, I thought you guys might have turned back," he said, forcing a laugh. I should have turned back. Over dinner, I tried to steer the conversation toward normal things, what he'd been up to, how life had been treating him. But his answers were vague, short, and clipped, like he was dodging something. Instead, he kept steering the conversation toward disturbing topics. "How deep do you think the snow gets out here?" he asked, swirling his fork in his hand. "Deep enough to bury things, you think? People?" I glanced at Luke, waiting for him to look as unsettled as I felt. But he just laughed. "Darren's always been into creepy stuff," he said, shaking his head like this was normal. Then Darren asked something that made my stomach twist. "You guys didn't tell anyone you were coming, right?" He said it casually, too casually, like he was checking. I barely slept that night. The cabin was old, and every gust of wind made it groan like a dying thing. The walls creaked, the wind screeched through the gaps in the wood, and the whole structure shuddered. Then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the floor settling, actual human footsteps. And then whispering. Low, hushed. Not Darren's voice. Someone else's. I held my breath, straining to listen. Darren was talking to someone. I squeezed my eyes shut, forced myself to stay still. I didn't want to know what he was saying. Just make it to morning, I told myself. At sunrise, we'll leave. At sunrise, I shook Luke awake. We need to go, I whispered. He groaned, half asleep. You're imagining things. But when we stepped outside, I froze. Our tire tracks were gone. Not covered in snow, gone. Like we'd never driven up here at all. My stomach dropped. My pulse hammered in my ears. Then I saw him, Darren, standing at the window watching us. Expressionless. Not moving. Not blinking. Just staring. And in that moment I knew. We were never supposed to leave. And I wasn't sure we ever would. It was 2010, and I was driving my Ford F-150 from my home in Pennsylvania to Georgia. I had family in the countryside, and I was planning to spend the week with them. The drive was going to take around 14 hours, and I decided to do it all in one day. I hit the road at 10 a.m., stopping once for lunch at a deli and later at a rest area to eat the turkey sandwiches I'd packed in my cooler. After that, I didn't plan on making any more stops except for gas. By 11:30 p.m., I was exhausted. I just filled up the tank one last time, and my GPS said I'd reach my cousin's house by 12:30 a.m. I was so close, but I was also dangerously tired. For some reason, I hadn't thought to grab coffee at the gas station. The route the GPS was taking me on seemed a little off. I wasn't on the highway anymore. Instead, I was winding through dark, empty country roads. My truck sat high off the ground, giving me a good view of everything, and I had a light bar installed that lit up the pitch-black road ahead. I knew I shouldn't have been driving, but I was so close. I convinced myself to push through. At a stop sign, I turned left onto an even quieter road. The speed limit was 45 miles per hour, but I was doing 55 to 60, speeding down the empty stretch. There were no buildings or houses, just dense woodland on either side. The road felt abandoned, like I was the only person for miles. Then, out of nowhere, I saw something ahead. Four shiny objects reflecting in my headlights. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding as I got closer. They were traffic drums, those big orange cylinders used to block off roads. My truck skidded to a stop just before hitting them. I grabbed my baseball bat and got out, confused and on edge. As I approached the drums, I realized there was something behind them. A spike strip, the kind police use to stop cars. My mind raced. Was this some kind of police operation? Or had someone set this up as a trap? I looked around cautiously, my grip tightening on the bat. The woods were silent, too silent. Then I heard it. A voice screaming, "Help!" It came from the woods on the left side of the road. My instincts screamed at me not to go in there. I called out, "What's wrong?" But there was no answer. I walked to the edge of the road, peering into the trees. My truck's lights barely pierced the darkness, but in the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Someone was crouched behind some bushes, watching me. I didn't run. I didn't want to provoke them. Instead, I casually walked back to my truck, trying to act calm. As I got in and shut the door, I glanced to my left. Two silhouettes were emerging from the woods, walking toward my truck. My heart raced as I threw the truck into gear. I swerved to the right, off the road and onto the dirt, bypassing the spike strip. I don't think they expected me to go around it. As I sped away, I checked the rearview mirror. At least 3 figures were standing by the traffic drums, barely illuminated by my taillights. A few seconds later, they were gone, swallowed by the darkness. I didn't look back. I just kept driving, my hands shaking on the wheel. I made it to my cousin's house a little after 12:30 a.m. I didn't tell them what had happened, not right away. I needed time to process it. To this day, I have no idea who those people were or what they wanted. All I know is that if I hadn't trusted my instincts, I might not have made it out of there alive. It was early June 2017, and I was on a road trip with my 9-year-old son, Tom, to visit family in West Virginia. The drive was long and stressful. My car didn't have working AC, and the summer heat was relentless. By the 6-hour mark, we were both exhausted and on edge. We'd left later in the day, so by the time the sun set, we were still on the interstate. It was around 9 p.m. when Tom started complaining that he needed to use the bathroom. The tension in the car had been building for a while. We'd had a small argument earlier. Nothing major, just personal stuff I'd rather not get into, but it left us both frustrated. Tom's constant whining about needing to stop didn't help. Finally, I saw a blue rest area sign flash by on the interstate and veered off the exit. The rest area was small and eerily quiet. There was a single building with 2 bathrooms, a couple of vending machines, and a few benches. No other cars were parked nearby except for a big white pickup truck. I pulled up next to the building, and Tom bolted out of the car, rushing to the bathroom. I left the engine running, figuring he'd be back soon. The argument had left us in that awkward silence where neither of us wanted to speak. I didn't know what to say to him, so I just sat there, staring at the dashboard. About a minute later, the back door opened. I assumed it was Tom, so I didn't say anything. I just put the car in drive and pulled back onto the interstate. As I merged onto the highway, I noticed the white pickup truck from the rest area was now behind me. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then the driver started flashing his lights. I switched to the right lane, thinking he was just an aggressive driver, but he followed me. He kept flashing his lights, and I started to feel uneasy. I slowed down, hoping he'd pass, but instead, he pulled up beside me in the middle lane and rolled down his window. My heart started racing as I cracked my window open. The guy looked rough, scruffy, with a beard and a baseball cap. He was yelling something and pointing at my car, but I couldn't make out what he was saying over the noise of the road. He gestured for me to pull over. I told Tom to stay calm, though I wasn't sure if he could even hear me. My mind was racing. If this guy tried anything, I'd floor it and get out of there. The pickup pulled over behind me, and the guy jumped out of his truck, running toward my car. I put the car back in drive, ready to take off, but then he shouted, "Wait!" He reached my window, out of breath, and said, "That's not your kid." He pointed to the back seat. I was completely confused. "What are you talking about?" I asked. He repeated, "That's not your kid. That's not who got in your car." Before I could process what he was saying, the back right door swung open. I turned around, expecting to see Tom, but instead, a tall figure, a fully grown man, climbed out of my car and sprinted into the woods. My heart stopped. I jumped out of the car, screaming after him, but he was already gone, swallowed by the darkness. I turned to the pickup driver, my hands shaking. "Thank you," I stammered, my mind racing. Where was Tom? I got back in the car, crossed the grass median, and sped back to the rest area. The pickup driver followed me. When we got back, Tom was standing outside the bathroom, looking confused. He climbed into the car, asking why I'd left without him. I was almost too shaken to speak. The pickup driver explained what had happened, and Tom's eyes widened in disbelief. The rest of the drive was a blur. Tom and I talked the whole way, the earlier tension completely forgotten. When we finally arrived at our family's house, we told them the story. They were as stunned as we were. To this day, I have no idea who that man was or what he wanted. I never even got a good look at his face. Maybe it's better that way. I don't know what I would have done if I had. All I know is that if it hadn't been for that pickup driver, things could have ended very differently.